Before we begin this emotional journey of resilience and redemption, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Just like Susan discovers unexpected treasures in her life, you'll find new stories that touch your heart with every subscription. Now, let's step into Susan's world. The birthday candles trembled in Susan Campbell's unsteady hands as she stood alone in the dimly lit garage. 68 years of life had not prepared her for spending her birthday night on a makeshift bed of old blankets spread across the concrete floor of an abandoned industrial building. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered, her voice echoing against the metal walls. 24 hours earlier, she had been packing her belongings in the Manhattan penthouse she had called home for over 4 decades. Her son Jonathan had been clear. The property was now his, according to Robert's will, and he needed her out by the end of the month. Susan had asked for more time, just enough to find suitable accommodations, but Jonathan's patience had worn thin. "Mother, I've given you 3 weeks already," he had said, not looking up from his phone. "The contractors are starting renovations tomorrow. I can't delay this project any longer." Susan had spent her last day in the penthouse surrounded by cardboard boxes, each one filled with fragments of the life she had built with Robert. 42 years of marriage reduced to containers labeled kitchen, bedroom, and memories. Now, as she blew out the single candle stuck in a store-bought cupcake, Susan found herself the sole occupant of the only property Robert had left her in his will, an old garage in a forgotten industrial district on the outskirts of the city. The lawyer had handed her the deed with an apologetic smile, as if embarrassed by the meagerness of her inheritance compared to the fortune Jonathan had received. The flame extinguished, casting the garage into deeper shadows. Susan pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The spring night was unseasonably cold, and the concrete walls offered little insulation. She had managed to bring only what would fit in her sedan: clothes, some personal items, and a few cherished photographs. She looked around at the cavernous space, barely visible in the dim light of her battery-powered lantern. It was large enough to house several vehicles, though currently empty except for some covered shapes in the far corner. Dust particles danced in the beam of her light, and cobwebs decorated the ceiling corners. "Well, Robert," she said aloud, "I don't understand. Why this place? Why leave me with nothing but an empty garage?" Her voice broke on the last word. Tears threatened, but Susan Campbell was not a woman who surrendered easily to despair. She had survived Robert's death 6 months ago. She would survive this, too. With determination born of necessity, she smoothed out her makeshift bed and prepared for her first night of homelessness. As she laid down, her lantern illuminated something she hadn't noticed before: a small envelope taped to the wall beside her. Her name was written across the front in familiar handwriting, Robert's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she reached for the envelope. Dawn broke over the industrial district, sending slanted rays of light through the garage's dirty windows. Susan hadn't slept much. The concrete floor had proven unforgiving to her aging body, but it wasn't physical discomfort that had kept her awake. It was the contents of Robert's letter. "My dearest Susan, if you're reading this, then things have gone exactly as I anticipated. I know you must be confused and hurt. For that, I am truly sorry. But I need you to trust me one last time. What appears to be my final cruelty is actually my final gift to you. Look beneath the tarps in the corner. All my love, always. Robert Now." In the early morning light, Susan approached the covered shape she had barely registered the night before. With cautious hands, she gripped the edge of the nearest tarp and pulled. The dust cloud that rose made her cough, but as it settled, her breath caught for an entirely different reason. Gleaming in the morning light was a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California Spider, one of the most valuable classic cars in the world. Its midnight blue exterior was immaculate, as if it had just rolled off the factory floor. Stunned, Susan moved to the next covered shape and pulled away the tarp. A 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing emerged, its silver body reflecting the light like a mirror. The third tarp revealed a 1967 Lamborghini Miura in pristine condition, its lime green paint job as vibrant as the day it was applied. Susan stepped back, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. These weren't just cars. They were multi-million-dollar treasures. Robert had been a car enthusiast all his life, but she had never known about these particular vehicles. As she circled the Ferrari in a daze, she noticed a metal file cabinet in the far corner of the garage. It hadn't been visible from her sleeping area. Moving toward it with growing curiosity, she found it unlocked. The top drawer slid open smoothly, revealing dozens of neatly labeled folders. The first folder she pulled out contained the title for the Ferrari, showing Robert as the owner and indicating its current market value, $4 million. The second folder held the Mercedes title, $3.5 million. The Lamborghini, $4.5 million. In total, the three cars were worth $12 million. But it was the next folder that made Susan sink to the floor in shock. Inside were deeds to properties scattered across the country, a lake house in Vermont, a beachfront condo in Florida, and most significantly, a cottage in Carmel, California. Accompanying the Carmel deed was another note in Robert's handwriting. "This one's for you, Susie. I had it renovated just the way you always described your dream home. The key is in the blue box on the shelf." Susan's eyes darted to the shelf above the cabinet where a small blue box sat waiting. Inside was a key tied with a ribbon, and another note. "One last thing. Check the folder marked Investments." The Investments folder revealed a complex network of accounts and securities all held in Susan's name, carefully structured to remain hidden until after Robert's death. According to the documentation, these investments were worth over $20 million. A final document detailed everything. 6 years ago, Robert had received a diagnosis of a heart condition with a poor long-term prognosis. Without telling Susan to spare her the worry, he had begun secretly reorganizing their assets. Jonathan, who had always been somewhat entitled but had grown increasingly money-hungry in recent years, was given the penthouse and the visible investments, but the bulk of Robert's true wealth had been carefully concealed for Susan alone. As the realization of her new reality washed over her, Susan alternated between laughter and tears. She was far from destitute. She was, in fact, wealthier than she had ever been. A handwritten note on the final page of Robert's explanation read, "Now you get to decide what happens next, my love, including what Jonathan deserves to know." 3 months later, Susan sat on the deck of her Carmel cottage, watching the Pacific waves crash against the shore. The transition from homeless to homeowner of a seaside property had been surreal, but she had adapted with remarkable resilience. The cottage was everything she had ever dreamed of. 2 bedrooms with ocean views, a kitchen with a professional range. Robert had remembered her passion for cooking, and a garden filled with her favorite flowers. It was as if Robert had extracted her most private wishes from their decades of conversations and manifested them in physical form. Her phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen displayed Jonathan's name, the 3rd time he'd called this week. She let it go to voicemail, as she had done with his previous attempts to reach her. She wasn't ready to speak to him yet, though she knew the conversation was inevitable. Susan had sold the Ferrari 2 weeks after discovering it, using part of the proceeds to set up a foundation in Robert's name focused on housing security for seniors. The irony wasn't lost on her. Becoming temporarily homeless had awakened her to a cause she now felt passionate about. The Mercedes and Lamborghini remained in secure storage. She couldn't bring herself to part with them just yet, seeing them as Robert's final tangible presence in her life. As she sipped her morning tea, Susan's thoughts drifted to Jonathan. Their relationship had always been complicated. As a child, he had been sensitive and creative, qualities Robert had sometimes struggled to understand in a son. As an adult, Jonathan had developed a hunger for status and wealth that troubled Susan. She had watched as he married and divorced twice, each relationship seemingly chosen to advance his social standing rather than for love. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. "Mother, please call me. It's urgent. I'm in serious trouble." Susan sighed. Part of her wanted to ignore this too, but maternal instinct won out. She dialed his number. "Jonathan, what's wrong?" His voice came through strained and unfamiliar. "I've made some terrible mistakes, Mother. The development project in Brooklyn, it's collapsed. The investors are threatening legal action, and the renovations on the penthouse went way over budget." Susan listened as he outlined his financial disaster. He had leveraged the penthouse to secure financing for a luxury development that had failed to receive proper permits. Simultaneously, he had spent lavishly to renovate the already opulent penthouse, assuming the development's profits would cover the costs. "I need your help," he concluded. "I know Father left you that garage, and I've heard rumors you sold something valuable from it. If you have any money, I need it now. I could lose everything." Susan closed her eyes, feeling the ocean breeze on her face as she considered her response. "Jonathan, I can help you, but we need to meet in person, and there will be conditions." "Conditions? Mother, I don't think you understand the severity." "I understand perfectly," Susan interrupted, a new firmness in her voice. "I'll be in New York next Tuesday. We'll meet at the Pierre Hotel at 2 in the afternoon. Until then, don't make any financial decisions." After ending the call, Susan gazed out at the ocean. Robert had given her not just wealth, but also power. The power to choose how to handle Jonathan, and perhaps the opportunity to finally address the issues that had plagued their relationship for years. The following Tuesday, Susan waited in the elegant lobby of the Pierre Hotel. She had chosen neutral ground for this meeting, somewhere Jonathan wouldn't feel either the entitlement of the penthouse or the humiliation of coming to her new home. She spotted him immediately when he entered. He looked thinner and far less confident than the man who had evicted her 3 months earlier. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Mother," he said, kissing her cheek perfunctorily. "You're looking well." "Let's sit," she replied, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the lobby. Once seated, Jonathan wasted no time. "I assume you've considered my situation. What kind of help can you offer?" Susan studied her son's face, Robert's chin, her eyes, but an expression that belonged to neither of them. Entitlement mixed with desperation. "Before we discuss money, I need you to understand what happened after your father died," Susan began. She told him about the garage, the cars, the hidden investments, though not the full extent of her inheritance. She watched as disbelief, shock, and then calculation crossed his features. "So you're wealthy now," he concluded. "More than wealthy enough to help me out of this situation." "I can help you," Susan confirmed. "But as I said, there will be conditions." Jonathan's laugh held no humor. "Conditions? That's rich coming from someone who was sleeping in a garage 3 months ago." Susan didn't flinch. "First condition, I'll establish a trust to pay off your debts, but you won't have direct access to the funds. My financial advisor will oversee all transactions." "You don't trust me with money?" Jonathan's face flushed with indignation. "Your current situation suggests that would be unwise," Susan replied calmly. "Second condition, you will attend therapy, both individually and with me, to address some long-standing issues." Jonathan stood abruptly. "This is absurd. I'm not a child you can control with your newfound wealth." "No, you're an adult facing the consequences of your actions," Susan said. "And this is not about control, it's about help. Real help, not just financial bailout. Sit down, please." To her surprise, he did. "Third condition," she continued. "You will work with my foundation for 1 year. We're developing affordable housing projects, something you have expertise in, albeit from a different angle." "Work? For a charity?" Jonathan looked genuinely bewildered. "Mother, I have a career." "A career currently in shambles," Susan pointed out. 1 year, Jonathan. Consider it a sabbatical and an opportunity to rebuild your professional reputation with something meaningful." Susan watched as her son struggled with her terms. His fingers drummed against his knee, a habit he'd had since childhood when feeling cornered. "And if I refuse?" he finally asked. "Then you refuse," Susan said simply. "I can't force you to accept my help, just as you couldn't force me to stay in that garage. We all make choices." Something in her calm delivery seemed to deflate him. For perhaps the first time since he was a teenager, Jonathan really looked at his mother, not as an extension of his father or a convenient caretaker, but as a person in her own right. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Because I love you," Susan replied, "and because your father loved you too, even though he saw the path you were heading down. This isn't punishment, Jonathan. It's an opportunity for both of us to do better." 2 days later, Papers were signed establishing the trust that would salvage Jonathan's financial situation. The amount was sufficient to cover his debts, but not extravagant enough to enable further reckless behavior. Susan had been strategic, guided by both Robert's attorney and her new financial advisors. Jonathan had accepted all three conditions, though not without further argument. Their first joint therapy session was scheduled for the following week, and he would begin working with the foundation after a brief orientation period. As spring turned to summer, Susan divided her time between her Carmel cottage and a modest apartment she purchased in New York to facilitate her foundation work and therapy sessions with Jonathan. The process was painful, revealing layers of resentment and misunderstanding that had accumulated over decades. "I always felt I was competing with the cars," Jonathan admitted during one particularly difficult session. "Dad spent more time with them than with me." "Your father struggled to connect emotionally," Susan acknowledged. "It wasn't just with you. He kept parts of himself walled off from everyone, even me. Those cars were safer companions than people for him." Gradually, through the structured environment of therapy, they began to unpack the complexity of their family dynamics. Robert had been a complicated man, brilliant in business, devoted to Susan in his way, but emotionally distant, particularly with Jonathan, whose sensitivity he had interpreted as weakness. Meanwhile, at the foundation, Jonathan's expertise in property development, when redirected toward affordable housing, proved genuinely valuable. He approached the work reluctantly at first, but Susan noticed subtle changes as weeks passed. He stopped checking his watch during meetings. He began offering ideas unprompted. He learned the names of the office staff. 6 months after their meeting at the Pierre, Susan and Jonathan sat in the foundation's conference room, reviewing plans for their first major project, the conversion of an abandoned school into senior apartments. "We should incorporate more community spaces," Jonathan suggested, pointing to the blueprint. "These residents will need places to socialize, not just to live." Susan studied her son's face as he explained his vision, noticing the animation in his features that had been absent for years. There was something of the creative, sensitive boy she remembered, the one who had gotten lost somewhere along the way to adulthood. "That's an excellent idea," she said. "Why don't you develop a proposal?" Later that evening, as they shared a meal at Susan's apartment, Jonathan broached a subject they had both avoided. "I want to apologize," he said, setting down his fork, "for evicting you. I've been thinking about it a lot in therapy, and I still can't believe I did that to my own mother." Susan felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying begin to lift. "Why did you?" she asked softly. Jonathan stared into his glass of water. "I was angry with Dad for dying, for leaving us, and you were a reminder, I guess. Plus, I thought I needed the money from selling the penthouse for my development." He laughed bitterly. Ironic that the development failed anyway. "We all make mistakes," Susan said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "The question is whether we learn from them." Autumn painted the Carmel coastline in spectacular colors as Susan hosted a small gathering at her cottage. The occasion was the first anniversary of her foundation, which had already completed 2 housing projects and had 4 more in development. Jonathan arrived early to help with preparations, bringing a bottle of Susan's favorite wine and a small wrapped package. "What's this?" Susan asked, taking the gift. "Just a token," he said. "Open it." Inside was a framed photograph of Susan, Robert, and a 5-year-old Jonathan at the beach. All 3 were laughing, sand covering their clothes, waves crashing behind them. "I found it while cleaning out some boxes in storage," Jonathan explained. "I thought you might like to have it." Susan traced the image with her finger, remembering that day. One of those rare perfect moments when Robert had fully relaxed, when Jonathan had felt secure in his father's attention, when they had truly been a family. "Thank you," she said simply, setting the frame on her mantelpiece. The gathering was small but meaningful. The foundation's staff, a few new friends Susan had made in Carmel, and Jonathan's new girlfriend Emma, a teacher he had met while volunteering at a community center near one of their housing projects. As Susan watched Jonathan with Emma, she noticed a gentleness in his manner that had been absent with his previous partners. There was no posturing, no obvious calculation of advantage, They simply seemed to enjoy each other's company. Later, as guests departed, Jonathan lingered to help clean up. As they washed dishes side by side, he said, "I've been offered a position with a community development organization in Chicago." Susan's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Chicago? That's quite a change." "It is," he agreed. "They focus on revitalizing neighborhoods through mixed-income housing. The salary is significantly less than I used to make, but," he shrugged, "it feels like the right move." "And Emma?" Susan asked. A smile softened his features. "She's considering coming with me. There are good schools there, and she's ready for a change too." Susan dried her hands and turned to face her son fully. "I'm proud of you, Jonathan. This past year hasn't been easy, but you've faced it with more courage than I expected." He ducked his head, still uncomfortable with direct emotional communication despite months of therapy. "I had a good example," he said quietly. "When everything was taken from you, you didn't fall apart. You rebuilt." After Jonathan left for his hotel, Susan walked along the beach in the moonlight. The past 18 months had transformed her life in ways she could never have anticipated on that cold night in the garage. She had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed and had found purpose beyond being Robert's wife or Jonathan's mother. The foundation work fulfilled her in unexpected ways, and she had developed a network of genuine friendships for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Her relationship with Jonathan, while still sometimes fragile, had evolved into something more authentic than their previous polite distance. As she watched the moonlight dance on the waves, Susan thought of Robert. Had he known how things would unfold? Had he anticipated that his elaborate plan would not only provide for her financially, but also create the opportunity for healing and growth? She liked to think he had. Despite his emotional limitations, Robert had known her better than anyone. Perhaps he had seen potential in both her and Jonathan that they had been unable to recognize in themselves. 2 weeks later, Susan stood in the garage where her journey had begun. She had kept it, transforming it into a small museum showcasing Robert's passion for classic cars. The Lamborghini and Mercedes remained, along with photographs and memorabilia from Robert's life. Jonathan had helped with the renovations before his move to Chicago, suggesting design elements and lighting that highlighted the car's beauty. It had become a project that bonded them, a way to honor Robert while acknowledging the complexity of his legacy. As Susan prepared to lock up, she noticed Jonathan standing in the doorway. "I thought you'd left for Chicago already," she said, surprised. "Tomorrow," he replied, stepping into the space. "I wanted to see this place one more time before I go." They walked around the garage together, Jonathan pointing out details of the cars that Susan had never noticed. His knowledge, inherited from hours spent listening to Robert despite their difficult relationship, was impressive. "Dad would have loved what you've done with this space," Jonathan said as they prepared to leave. "I think so," Susan agreed, "though he might have been surprised by how things turned out for all of us." Jonathan hesitated, then asked, "Do you think he meant for all of this to happen? The foundation? Our reconciliation? My new direction?" Susan considered the question. "I don't think he could have planned every detail, but he knew that giving me independence would change our dynamics, and perhaps he hoped that would lead to something better for both of us." As they stood in the doorway of the garage where Susan had once spent her 68th birthday, alone and afraid, Jonathan did something unexpected. He hugged her, not the perfunctory embrace of social obligation, but a genuine expression of affection. "I'll call every week," he promised. "And you'll visit Chicago for Christmas?" "I wouldn't miss it," Susan assured him. 1 year later, on the evening of her 70th birthday, Susan sat in the garden of her Carmel cottage surrounded by friends. The foundation was thriving, now with offices in 3 cities, including Chicago, where Jonathan had become an integral part of the affordable housing movement. Emma had indeed followed him to Chicago, and they were now engaged, planning a small wedding for the following spring. The therapist had described Jonathan's transformation as remarkable, from a man defined by acquisition and status to someone finding fulfillment in meaningful work and authentic relationships. As Susan blew out the candles on her cake, she made no wish. Her life felt complete in a way it never had before, even during the comfortable years with Robert. She had discovered that security came not just from financial resources, but from knowing her own capabilities, from connections with others, from purpose. After the party, as guests departed with hugs and promises to meet again soon, Susan found herself alone on her deck watching the sunset. Her phone rang, Jonathan calling for their weekly conversation. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said warmly. The mother of their formal past had evolved into the more affectionate mom over time. "Thank you, sweetheart. How are the wedding plans coming?" They chatted easily about his life in Chicago, Emma's latest school project, and the foundation's new initiatives. As the conversation wound down, Jonathan said, "I found something in Dad's old files that I think you should see. I'm emailing it to you now." Susan opened her laptop and found Jonathan's email. Attached was a scanned document, a letter from Robert to his attorney, dated shortly before his death. "The arrangements we've discussed for Susan and Jonathan reflect my best understanding of what they both truly need, rather than what they believe they want. Susan has always had strength she doesn't recognize. Giving her true independence may finally allow her to discover it. As for Jonathan, his path has concerned me for some time. The penthouse and visible portfolio will satisfy his current materialistic focus, but when those prove insufficient, as I believe they will, perhaps he'll be ready to look deeper. Susan will be his best guide through that process, but only if she's standing on her own ground. I regret that I won't witness the outcome of this plan. I hope that someday they'll both understand it wasn't about the money at all, but about giving them the opportunity to become their best selves, something I was never quite able to help them achieve in life." Tears blurred Susan's vision as she finished reading. "Oh, Robert," she whispered. "He knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he?" Jonathan said over the phone. "For both of us." "He did," Susan agreed. "In his own way, it was an act of love." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the Pacific, Susan felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun in an abandoned garage with nothing but a cupcake and a candle had led her here, to a life richer not just in financial terms, but in meaning, purpose, and connection. Later that evening, after ending the call with Jonathan, Susan walked along the shoreline near her cottage. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, and the rhythm of the waves provided a soothing soundtrack to her thoughts. She reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment, how what had seemed like Robert's final betrayal had actually been his greatest gift. Not just the material wealth, but the opportunity to discover her own strength, to rebuild her relationship with Jonathan, and to create meaning beyond the roles of wife and mother that had defined her for so long. As she turned to head back to her cottage, Susan noticed an older couple walking hand in hand along the beach. The woman laughed at something her companion said, leaning into him with easy familiarity. Susan smiled, recognizing in their connection something she had shared with Robert in their best moments, but also something different, something she was now creating in her new life. Joy rooted in genuine self-knowledge and choice rather than dependence. The path ahead was open, full of possibilities she was only beginning to explore. At 70, Susan Campbell had discovered that life could begin again in unexpected ways, and that the greatest inheritance wasn't measured in dollars or property deeds, but in the capacity to grow, to forgive, and to find purpose in helping others. If you've enjoyed Susan's journey from that cold garage to a life of purpose and reconciliation, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps bring more stories of resilience and redemption to life. Comment below with your thoughts. Has someone in your life ever helped you discover strength you didn't know you had?